What happens when a child is malnourished? Can such a child ever catch up later in life? Why do urbanization and obesity seem to go hand in hand, and what does this mean for food production? We will explore big picture questions today with a person uniquely suited to understand the big picture, Dr. Shenggen Fan, a man who was named a hunger hero in 2014 by the World Food Program. I am Kelly Brownell, Director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University and Professor of Public Policy at Duke. Shenggen Fan is Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, also known as IFPRI, a highly regarded organization with more than 600 employees working in more than 50 countries. Dr. Fan oversees an extensive research program focused on development strategies in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. He is dedicated to inspiring ambition, to mobilizing action, and to accelerating progress in cutting global food loss and waste. He was appointed by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to serve on the Scaling Up Nutrition movement and is an advisor on agriculture, food insecurity, and nutrition to many national governments, including China and Vietnam. And all of us here at the World Food Policy Center owe Shenggen a special thanks for being part of a summit meeting we convened with World Food Policy leaders just as the center was being formed. We are graced today by someone with exceptional talent who is making a real difference in the world. Shenggen, welcome to our podcast series.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let's begin with some context. There are few people in the world who can see the food picture and the global food picture as you do. What do you believe are some of the key food issues facing the world?
Well, there are a couple of challenges we're facing. Firstly, we are facing multi-burden of malnutrition. So on the one hand, we have more than 800 million people who are still hungry, meaning that they do not have enough to eat. In fact, for the last 2 or 3 years, that number has been rising because of conflict, climate change, and so on. So that's number one burden. Number two burden is hidden hunger. We actually don't see them. The lack of micronutrients, iron, zinc, vitamins, vitamin A, and beyond. And we have more than 2 billion people who suffer from that. The third is overnutrition, overweight, obesity. Again, we have more than 2 billion people in the world who suffer from overweight, obesity. As you know, overweight, obesity leads to non-communicable diseases, heart diseases, strokes, diabetes, and beyond. So this is the number one challenge we are facing. Number two is, yes, the climate change. Climate change affects our life, but climate change affects our food system much more than anything else. So our crop yield will be affected. Even the nutrition, latest evidence shows that if the global warming continues, the micronutrients or nutrition of certain crops will be affected negatively, which means that it will not only affect the amount of food we're going to eat, but also affect the quality, nutrition element of the food we are going to eat. So the climate change is a big issue. The third one is urbanization. We know that when the people move to cities, they demand more and better food. Just 2 or 3 years ago, we crossed a line of 50-50, 50% urban population, 50% rural population. I think today probably more than 52 to 55%. And by 2050, 2/3 of our population will be in urban areas, demanding more and better food, demanding more water, land, and so on, and more construction of residential areas. So that also affects the supply of our food. So I think we're facing all these challenges in long term. In short run, the conflicts, the droughts in many parts of Africa, in South Asia, have led to many people go hungry. And that sort of short run impact is not going to go away very soon. So the challenges are grave, and we must work together to make sure that people have enough to eat, people have nutritious, healthy food to eat.
Well, we could talk for hours about some of the things that you just mentioned, but let me focus on just a few things. One is you mentioned 800 people
800 million.
malnourished around the world. and then hidden hunger beyond that. What are some of the consequences of this? I mean, we hear these large numbers, but what are the real effect on people in their lives of being malnourished?
Well, clearly, when people are malnourished, their human capital will be affected. So their physical capability, their cognitive skills will be affected. So once a child is malnourished or stunted, it's like a death sentence. So the whole life of that child will be affected. So from our study, it shows that every year, we lose trillions of dollars because of different burdens of malnutrition. So it's a human development issue, it's an economic issue, and it's also health issue. Just to give you one example about the malnutrition problem in the U.S. So for the last 2 years or 3 years, the United States life expectancy has declined. Obviously, there are many reasons. For example, the overuse of certain drugs and so on. But one of the important factors is the diet. So the bad diet leads to overweight, obesity, and again that they lead to many non-communicable diseases. So that's in U.S. In Africa, in South Asia, many countries lose 10% of the GDP equivalent every year because of malnutrition. So it is a serious problem to everybody in the world.
Let's talk for a moment more about the climate change issue that you brought up. You said that climate change could affect the nutrients in foods, but I know it can also have an impact on where foods will grow. What does that picture look like as time goes forward?
Absolutely. So we know that if the temperature of our planet increases by 2 degrees, let's say by 2050 or by the end of the century, the amount of our food produced will be affected in many parts of the world, particularly poor areas of our planet, Africa and South Asia. Many crops will lose the yield by 30% to, in some extreme cases, could be 50%. Could you imagine they would lose 30%, 50% of the yield, in the next 50 to 100 years in many, many extreme areas. But equally important is micronutrients. We have evidence that show that certain vitamins, certain even proteins of our foods will be affected, which means many people will go either visible hunger or hidden hunger. And if we don't address that, and more people will be affected, we'll lose our human capital, our health, and our economic development.
So if the warmer places in the world, say in sub-Saharan Africa, are already having trouble feeding themselves, this will just exacerbate the problem. Now, could one make the argument that areas that are now too cold to grow food will be able to with global warming, and the same amount of food might get produced overall? It'll just be moved to a different location?
Well, there's a truth to some extent, but it's a dry, hot area. Let's say in Africa, and a certain hot, humid area in Asia, South Asia, that will be affected much more unproportionately. And that's where the poor and hungry people live, and they do not have capacity, they do not have means to adapt to that. And in northern part of our planet, yes, they may begin to produce some of the crops that have never been produced, but that will not be able to offset large loss from the southern part of the planet. And also, the warmer climate in the northern part may also bring the diseases, whether it's human diseases or animal disease or crop diseases, that could affect our production negatively.
This climate change issue is so interesting. To what extent do you think technology can save us from this? I mean, for example, can genetically modifying food to better resist drought, hot conditions, and things like that help stave off this problem?
Well, the technology is very critical here. The technology will help farmers to adapt to climate change. For example, the climate is getting warmer or getting colder. So the newer crops can adapt to the new climate, so they can still produce more, even better food. So we call it adaptation. We have seen a lot of crops already in many parts of Africa, many parts of South Asia. So they begin to introduce new crop varieties, which is the technology that can help to survive in a very hot, let's say, environment, or in a very wet environment, or in a very sort of it's a submerged environment. So we have seen that already, but more needs to be done. But here I also wanted to mention another dimension, Kelly, that is mitigation. So many technologies, many crop varieties can actually help mitigate the climate change by reducing carbon emission to our air. As you know, our agriculture and food system account for somewhere between 20 to 30% of the total carbon emission. And we have made tremendous progress in energy sector, in transportation sector, but our food and agriculture sector lags behind. So the newer technology must also help to mitigate the climate change, to reduce the carbon emission to the air, or help to sequestrate the carbon into the soil.
Shenggen, in your introductory comments, you mentioned urbanization. Let's talk about rural areas a bit. What role can rural areas play in the context of food, and what are some of the key actions that might be taken?
Well, I think it's very critical, very critical. Part of the reason why people wanted to move to the urban area is because there's a lack of opportunity in rural areas. The environment has been degraded, such as water, land, the whole ecosystem. And to a large extent, this is also related to agricultural food production. In Asia, many farmers or food production overuse fertilizers, pesticides, water, and so on. As a result, the water has been contaminated, land has been degraded, and in some areas, even air has been polluted because of the burning of certain straws. So I think the rural areas has been, to some extent, has been sort of degraded because of the different farming practice and so on. But that does not mean there is no chance. There is a chance. How we're going to revitalize the rural areas? By fixing the environmental problem, by fixing the living conditions. For example, if a young farmer or young people wanted to stay in rural areas, that person needs a good job. I do think agriculture, food, or related service sector can provide good jobs, or even the distance, so-called distance working can also provide jobs in rural areas, rural towns. And then they also need entertainment, movie theaters, and banking services, restaurant services. So if we can provide all these services, opportunities, and fix the environment, I think a lot of people will stay in rural areas without moving to the cities. Cities are already very crowded. Housing is very expensive. Traffic is terrible. So part of our strategy, from my institute, is to look at different ways, different strategies, different investment priorities to revitalize rural areas. So the young people can stay or even come back to rural areas to enjoy their work, enjoy their lives. So great opportunity. As you know, right now, the trade frictions among different countries can also, I think that revitalizing rural areas can also help to avoid that problem. If you wanted to revitalize rural areas, you create a big demand for infrastructure, big demand for investment, big demand for services, big demand for food, and so they will be more resilient to any trade shocks.
So Shenggen, what would you say some of the leading priorities are to ensure healthy and sustainable food systems around the world?
I think number one is innovation. You already mentioned about innovation. But here, I think it's not just the innovations in technology. I have already said that now the newer technologies have multiple wins. The win in yield, they win in nutrition, they win in environment, cutting down water use, land use, cutting down energy use, cutting down the carbon emission. So newer technologies we try to introduce today must have all these wins. So that's number one. Second is innovation in policy, which is very much ignored by many, so which is equally important. So how can we reform the current investment or support policy to agriculture? Right now, at this moment, we are using $500 billion to subsidize farmers to use more water, more land, more energy, more pesticides to produce stable foods like rice, wheat, and maize at the cost of more nutritious, healthy, or sustainable foods, vegetables, fruits, dairy products, and beyond. So reforming subsidy policy. Let's say gradually eliminating these subsidies and use that money to promote more nutritious and healthy food production, I think has great potential. And even further, I also wanted to propose taxing unsustainable foods and use that money again to promote healthy, nutritious, and sustainable foods production. I think innovation in policy is equally important. And finally, the governance. How can we make sure that our politicians are accountable to nutrition, health, environmental outcome is very critical. So that comes back to your institute and my institute. So we can help to generate the data, generate the metrics, generate evidence to make sure that different stakeholders, including politicians, the private sector, our citizens, are accountable to what we wanted to achieve.
So Shenggen, at various times in our conversation, you mentioned food insecurity, you mentioned overnutrition, obesity, and you mentioned agriculture. How important is it to connect these areas, to look at the intersection of these areas, to bring together people who work in what are now pretty segmented areas?
I think it's a system. So today we're talking about agri-food system. So agriculture is a system, food is system. So that system not only just produces food, produces nutritious, healthy food for everybody, but also helps to address environmental problems, climate change problems. So the agri-food system have two overarching goals. So on the one hand, the health, nutrition of everybody in the world. On the other hand, it's a good environment, help to mitigate the climate change for everybody. So every stakeholder in this system, farmers, processors, traders, consumers, even the government officials, the private sector must be part of that system to work together to achieve these two overarching twin goals.
Well, you've talked about some pretty daunting problems during our discussion. Are there reasons to be optimistic?
Well, I am. We have seen lots of successes in many different countries, even in Africa, South Asia, even here in the US. So we have seen successes here and there. If we can really learn from these successes and to generate knowledge, generate best fit practices that people can use to accelerate the progress, I truly believe we can transform, reshape our agri-food system to achieve these two goals at the same time.
Well, it's nice to end on such a positive note. I very much appreciate your time with us. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
So our guest today was Shenggen Fan, Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute. And thank you to our listeners. Please subscribe to the leading voices in food at Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, or iTunes, or by visiting our website at the Duke World Food Policy Center. This is Kelly Brownell.